Welcome to Web Development Lesson 3.4. In this lesson, we're going to introduce the input element, which will allow us to interact with the user via JavaScript. We're going to lightly introduce the concept of storing elements, which involves variables. And we're going to introduce a basic UI that we're going to use over the next couple of videos in terms of being able to interact with the user. So let's get to it. So the HTML element we're going to introduce in this video is the input element. Now the input element has an attribute called type that allows you to change the type of input it is. Now if you kind of think about what the element's called, it's called an input element. So it's meant for the user to interact. And trust me, you've seen these things on various websites such as buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, which are those little circles you can click on. Password inputs, the ability to upload a file, to select a date, possibly from a little pop-up calendar. So the input element is very flexible because of this type attribute. We're only going to focus on a couple though. So let's go to Replit and let's introduce our first input element. So the most common way for people to interact with a website is to type stuff in. So we're going to do the type attribute, and as you can see, because we're in an IDE, it tries to help us out. But trust me, you're going to remember this one, type text. And let's just run it and see what we get. So we get a nice little box that we can type in. But looking at the user looking at this box has no indication as to what the box is for. So a text input has an additional attribute called placeholder, which you can use to provide some instructions. So here we see enter name. Okay, you want me to enter my name here. Now the cool thing about the placeholder is that as you start typing, the words go away. When the box is empty, the instructions come back on. Now, because we're going to want to program with this input, we're going to give it an ID. And an obvious ID to give it is name, because that's what we're having the person enter into this box. All right, let's go into another input that you'll be seeing a lot of, which is the button. And we're going to leave it just like this for now. Okay, nothing special. The button's here. You'll notice that the button's offset a little bit. It's offset because there's nothing in the button in terms of displaying. So let's fix that. Now you might think, well, we use placeholder for the type text in order to put some words on it, but there is another attribute that we're going to have to use with the button, which is the value attribute. And we'll simply say click me. So the value attribute represents the words that are inside of an input element. Now we could have actually done that up here too. So let me show you that. So you'll notice that the words are still there, but the words are black now. And the reason for that is that this is the actual text that's in there. So for me to enter my name, I will have to delete what's there, enter my name. Now if I do that and then erase my name, notice there's no more instructions, which is why for a input type text, it's better to use the placeholder for the instructions instead of the value. Now I want you to remember the value attribute. It does exist in the text element. We're going to be using that when we get to the JavaScript. Now, buttons are meant to be clicked on. And you'll notice right now, if we click on it, nothing happens. So let's add an event listener of an on click, and let's send it somewhere. Let's say that this is meant to give us a greeting. Shrink this out a little bit so we get it all on the same screen. So buttons will typically have an on click with some event handler to handle what happens when you click on it. An input type text will typically have an ID because we're going to want to interact with that particular element. Now, the last thing we're going to introduce as part of our basic UI is a div. We're going to give it an ID, again, because we're going to program it. And now this gives us an area on the screen that we can display some information. Now, I want to show you that the on-click does work with the button. Let me run this again. But if you kind of take a second and think about what's going to happen, it's not going to display anything. It's not going to display the name. Remember, on-click, it's looking for a function called greeting. I don't know about you, but I don't see it on the screen. And sure enough, neither does JavaScript. So it says that greeting is not defined. So let's go ahead and define greeting. And let's run it again. And let's click on the button. Nothing happens, but in a way, something did happen. We didn't get an error. So that's a good thing. So we've kind of completed our basic, loop of, an input, a button, an event listener, an event handler, and we got the function. Now let's actually do some work. So let's start with our document, get element by ID. And let's grab that input, the first one. And just as a way of kind of demonstrating what you end up getting, let's do an alert. So when I click on the button, the event listener is going to be triggered. We're going to call the event handler, which is the greeting function. The greeting function is going to grab the element with an ID of name, which happens to be this input type text, and then we're going to display it using the alert. Again, and this, you guys have to get used to this. This is the life cycle of a JavaScript program. You get some kind of user input, you have a function, you might grab some stuff, and then display some information. And there you go. We have HTML input element. So just as a review, the document get element by ID does let you grab any type of element as long as it has an ID. Now, one thing I want to do here is I want to introduce variables. Variables are a way for us to represent information, store information. There's a whole separate video that goes into more detail about variables. For right now, let's just say that we want to let a variable name equal to this element. Now, some students, when they first see this, they start to think that, okay, name's going to equal whatever the person typed in. And let's say I type in, actually, let me finish this part out before I type, because then I have to refresh the screen. So, I'll challenge students with, alert name. What's it going to display? And many will say it will display the name that's typed into the box. But remember, name is equal to document get element by ID. And we just saw that document get element by ID returns this whole input. And sure enough, that's what we're still getting. In order for us to get the actual name, we got to do this. We want the value of what's inside the input type text, not the whole thing. So doing this now, keep typing my name wrong. Now we actually get the name that's in the box. Okay, so please remember that when you work within any input type, the value attribute, the value property, is the one that represents the information that's actually in the input. All right, so let's get back to what we wanted to do, which is let's create variables. Let's grab everything that's on the screen that has an ID. And this is a very common practice to do prior to doing any kind of coding. Let's just create variables for every element that's on the screen that has an ID, because if it has an ID, we probably want to program it. So let's grab the output one. And if you recall, an output, this div, we can use inner HTML to actually display information in it. And let me show you that too. Just kind of take small steps, because now we're introducing the idea of variables to go with it. So the output represents this. So if I do inner HTML, that means I can modify the information that's in this element. And let's simply say hello. Let's run it. And you can see here that the words hello pop up inside the div. Now in a previous video, we had done it like this, where we put document.getInnerHTML equals hello. But if you think about what variables are, variables represent information. If this equals this, then hopefully you can make the connection that I can simply substitute. This is that. So wherever I want to put this, I can now put this variable name. Again, that's one of the strengths of using variables. So let's continue on, because it'll be cool for us to be able to say hello in the person's name. So let me put a little space here. We're going to use a concept called string concatenation. So this plus sign will add two strings. It'll add two pieces of information together. And let's simply put the person's name. And I almost forgot. Let's put semicolons here. It's a good practice to get into. It terminates a line. Unlike a programming language like Java, where if you leave the semicolon out, it will yell at you. JavaScript won't yell at you, but it's a good practice to get into, to terminate your lines with a semicolon. So I want you to take a second and think about what's going to get displayed. Hello plus the name. Spelled it right this time. So hopefully you kind of realize we ran into the same predicament we did earlier. That name represents the whole text box, the whole input type text. So if I want to get the value of what's inside the input type text, I got to put name.value. Remembering that name represents the whole text box. So if I want the value, put that value. Again, this is a very common mistake that beginning web developers make in terms of working with elements, the input element in JavaScript. Okay, so there you have it. We've done a lot in this video. So we introduced the input element, which is a great way to interact with the user, and there's many different options. We focused on only two, which is the input type text and the input type button, which will allow the person to type something in and then click on a button to make an action happen. We lightly introduced variables as a way to store elements. Again, variables can be used for more than just storing elements, but in this video, that's all we covered. We also introduced a basic UI of an input type text, an input type button, and a div in order to display information to the screen. In the next videos, we're going to start going into more traditional programming concepts. So please make sure you review this video. This is going to be your basic design programming pattern over the next couple of videos. Enjoy.